So hello everyone, this is part of the video that we are starting. This is Translanguaging and Trans-semiotics lab for the YouTube channel. Today we are hosting a Gary Barkhuizen at University of Auckland, Department of Applied Linguistics, I suppose. And Gary has been very well-known scholars for narrative inquiry, particularly in applied linguistics and TESOL. Today we are here to interview him as an emerging scholar who wants to know more about the narrative inquiry. So here we go. So the first question, situating ourselves in applied linguistics. Could you please tell us why is it important to consider narrative inquiry or narrative knowledging?
Okay, firstly, thank you very much for the welcome. It's really nice to be here. Situating narrative inquiry in applied linguistics. Well, as you know, in the field of applied linguistics, there's a very broad range of research methodologies that range from quite positivistic methodologies using experiments to quite qualitative research methodologies. And narrative inquiry fits more towards the qualitative end if you want to use that simplistic distinction of qualitative research. The thing that narrative inquiry does is it really gets to the personal experiences of the people that applied linguists are interested in, whether they're language learners or language teachers or immigrants or people in the workplace. So those are just some of the examples where applied linguistics have some interest in what's going on with the participants that researchers are interested in. But narrative inquiry really focuses on the particularities of the work that they do. It gets down to the detail of their lives, to their very personal experiences, but most importantly from their perspective, not only from the perspective of the researcher, but from the perspective of the participants themselves. And often what we hear about their experiences are the stories that they tell about their experiences. So very central to narrative inquiry are the stories that our participants tell about their experiences of language learning or language teaching or whatever the case may be. And the researcher works together with those participants to generate those stories of experience. And one last point is that in telling those stories and sharing those stories and co-constructing those stories with the researcher, there's a lot of meaning making going on, a lot of understanding of those experiences. So you reflect on them, try to understand them, you interpret them in order to get a better understanding of the particular phenomenon that you are interested in, whether it's identity or a teaching practice or a way of learning and so on. So rather than trying to generalize across a large population of people, it's trying to learn about the specifics of a particular individual or a small group of people in a local context.
Why is it important to understand the particularities then?
Well, it's important to understand that because often research looks at the big picture, and there's certainly a place for that. We need to be able to generalize across big populations, across large geopolitical areas. That's important work. But if that's all we do, we miss out on the full picture. What we need to understand also is how people live their lives within those contexts as well. So I'm not saying it completes the picture or that it's supporting the other research, but those types of research can work together. So it really gives us a fuller account of a particular area of interest that we're focusing on, a particular topic or whatever the focus of the research is. So it enables us to understand the specifics of the lives of the people that we are interested in working with, that we work with as researchers, that practitioners work with, not only in terms of work, but in terms of people who live lives as refugees or as immigrants. All the types of populations that applied linguists are interested in from a research perspective, particularly.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, as myself, a PhD student in here, I'm very lucky to have read your book about narrative inquiry, and my research interest is on emotions. And I feel that there's quite a lot of potential that narrative inquiry would be able to contribute to the research of emotion and effect. Would you please to elaborate more on that?
Yeah, so central to the work of narrative inquiry are the stories that people tell about their lives, and the stories that they share with researchers, or the stories they tell amongst themselves that researchers are interested in. And when we tell stories, there's always emotion embedded in those stories. The stories are filled with emotion. If you listen to any story, it's hardly a story if there's no emotion there.
Yeah.
And so in the past few years, there's been a lot of interest in those stories. I mean, in those emotions that are a central part of those stories, that are so evident in those stories. And some work's been done from different perspectives. So those narrative inquirers who are interested in the content of stories, what stories are about, look for evidence in those stories where it's obvious that emotions are being expressed or emotions are being spoken about. So sometimes a storyteller will explicitly say, I feel this, or I feel that, or when I did this, I experienced this emotion. So it's sometimes quite explicitly said in the text, but sometimes narrative researchers, for example, who do interaction type work, discourse analysis, conversation analysis, look at much more detail of the text of the story. They focus on the narrative as text, and there they look at how the emotions are expressed interactionally in the process of social interaction. So there are different ways of looking at emotion, but it's always there. It's always there in the stories that narrative inquirers look at, and it's absolutely interconnected with story and with the experience of people's lives. So we've got the experience of people's lives, we've got the story in which those experiences are shared, and there's the emotion that's connected to all of those. So as you've said, that there's a lot of interest now in emotion, with some excellent literature that's come out in the field, some excellent research that's come out in the field. Matthew Pryor is, for example, has a very, very good book on emotionality that I guess you both know. That's worth reading. Elizabeth Miller and others in the field are writing some excellent work on emotions as well.
I have one quick question though, about narrative knowledging, and how the narrative knowledging can amplify the importance of the emotion. Because to me, the word know is more of a knowing, is more intellectual or cognitive. Like it projects cognitive side, or emphasis on the more of a cognitive processes of knowing things.
Yes.
But it doesn't, this narrative inquiry doesn't necessarily restrict to knowing the world, but also having emotional empathy and understanding. And how does that be related?
Yes, it's a good question. Yeah, by narrative knowledging, I simply mean the meaning making, the understanding that takes place from a research perspective, that takes place during the process of generating stories, sharing stories, analyzing stories, looking at stories, interpreting stories, sharing stories, and so it's the whole research process when working with narrative. And yes, it's a meaning-making process, so it is a cognitive process because it's meaning-making, but it's also very social. Because when we work with stories, mostly we tell stories to other people.
Yeah.
So the meaning-making takes place when we are telling stories to other people. The storytelling process is usually a social process. I say usually because sometimes in autobiography or autoethnography there's a lot of self-reflection and telling stories to oneself and interpreting one's own story within particular contexts. So when you look at the social side of that, and even when it's looking at when the stories are auto in some sense, there's still emotion there, because with stories it's hardly a story if there's no reflection or no evaluation of the action of the story. So the story has action, there are things happening, that's what makes it a story. But if it's just simply a list of events, it's not really a story. There's got to be some commentary on what's going on with that action. And it's usually there where the emotion is expressed, either for oneself or to the audience of that story, or to the person who is co-constructing that story with the storyteller. So there's plenty of opportunity for the emotion. It's not opportunity, it's almost central that the emotion is part of that narrative knowledging. Because that narrative knowledging, it quite simply means there's meaning making about a particular experience of the storytelling, of the storyteller rather.
And it kind of, when you highlight the practices, it also makes me to understand it's not just the practices that were happening in during the interviewing context, but the processes of while the researcher is coding the data, and then the processes that the researcher reporting the data, the processes the audience interpret what's being written as well.
That's right. So
different dimensions.
It's all of those stages, and it's not just sort of linear that it's that stage, then that, but it's moving back and forth all the time. So it's, it sounds like a simple model, but it's far more complex than that. And just as you've mentioned, there are multiple stages with multiple people in very complex relationships, and it's a moving back and forth with the meaning making that's taking place all the time. And the meaning making is about the experiences of the research participants, the people that the researchers are interested in investigating. That's the focus, because it's not that it's the participant stories that we're interested in. They own the stories, and as researchers we may be there to co-construct, to help them to articulate the stories, but we are a part of that storytelling as researchers, and we have to acknowledge that, and we need to be honest about how much we were involved in the co-construction of those stories. But the stories are the participant stories. It's their experiences that we as researchers are interested in, and throughout that narrative knowledging process that you mentioned, we need to keep in mind that the narrative knowledging is about those participants' experiences.
Since we've already come, since we already come to the section of methodology, and you mentioned all the steps in narrative inquiry, I come up with it reminds me of an example that you give in your book regarding teachers' language learning history. So you suggested a framework, a narrative framework for the participants to fill in their stories. So, and I was wondering that, yes, if we do not offer a frame like that, so it is it may be more difficult for us to find maybe patterns or structures in the story. But if a frame is provided to the participants, there could be a possibility that we are like constraining what they want to say in their story. So how do you find a balance between this? How did you make the choice of coming up with working out a narrative framework?
Okay, so firstly, it's called a narrative frame, And the purpose of a narrative frame, okay, so it's got strengths and it's got some limitations.
Yeah.
It's just a research tool. It's an instrument. It's a way of collecting data. And it's quite, well, what it consists of, well, the way I've used it is a series of sentence starters followed by blanks. And the sentence starters followed by blanks, then another sentence starter and a blank, another sentence starter and a blank. Altogether, it forms a story about a particular topic that the researcher is interested in learning about. All right? So you design the topic, you design the content of the story, because you're putting the sentence starters. And so you know what the story is going to be about. But because they're blanks, the respondent can contribute to the story, because it's they in the blanks are writing about their actual experiences. So you're designing the content of the story, but the respondents are making it their story because they're completing the sentence starters by writing about their experiences. You also are designing the structure of the story. And there may be limitations there because different cultures may have different ways of telling stories and so on. But you're designing the structure, the organization of the story, the way the story is told. All right. Now, if you're working with one participant, it's pointless using a narrative frame. You might as well sit down and talk to them, right? Because why do a narrative frame? So it's not meant for working with one participant or two or three or four. You can interview them, right? But where it's useful is if you are working with a large group.
Right.
So the first time I used narrative frames was with a colleague, Rosemary Vetter. We went to do a professional development program in Beijing, in China. And at the professional development program, there were over 200 teachers.
Oh.
Over 200, 220 or something. And we thought it would be useful to find out a little bit about their experiences of being college English teachers. And so we designed a series of frames, that, four frames, and we distributed to over 200 teachers. Right. We couldn't interview 200 teachers because we were only there for a few days.
Right.
So we distributed these 200 frames, these 4 frames, to over 200 teachers. 4 frames on like different topics. And when we got them and we analyzed them, we learned an enormous amount about that particular context, about that particular group of teachers. So it was just a way of becoming familiar with a new environment or a new context with a large group of people. And where it is quite useful is once you've done that, then you can generate some research questions that you can then use in a follow-up study with a smaller group of teachers that then you could do some real narrative inquiry work with, for example. So there's a lot of possibilities of working with narrative frames, with observations, with follow-up interviews with a smaller group, and so on. So it's got a lot of potential for use with other methods. But essentially, it's important when, I think it's useful when you've got a large number of people to work with, or you want to explore a new context as a researcher, explore a new context for the first time because you are unfamiliar with it, for example.
Right.
Yeah.
So it seems like we are now talking about the pedagogical implication, in fact, or how this narrative inquiry that has that can be viewed as a very small number of participants and small sets of data can be enlarged into more with a larger sets with teacher development and so forth. So could you please tell us more about the different possibilities of narrative inquiry for example, teacher education?
Yeah.
And what kind of design processes that may involve? Is there any examples that you could share, or what were the outcomes that you have found, and so forth?
Okay. So when we talk about narrative inquiry, we can talk about it from a researcher's perspective, and that's what I've been doing so far. And even when talking about the narrative frames, we had 4 different frames that focused on 4 different topics. One frame that I was particularly interested in was whether the college English teachers did research themselves, and if they did research, or if they wanted to do research, what type of research they would do, and what topics they would focus on. And so in analyzing the themes that came up in the responses to the sentence starters, I was able to find out what some of the topics they would like to research themselves. For example, how to motivate their students was one thing. And they had issues with the materials that they were using. They had a number of problems that they experienced that they would like to have done research on, or would like to do research on. And so that was quite useful information that I wrote an article on, and people have read that. And so for the people designing the professional development programs themselves, that was quite useful. They could use that for further professional development work and so on. But narrative inquiry can also be used by teachers for teachers. It doesn't necessarily have to be used by researchers on teachers or on learners and so on. So narrative inquiries can be a methodology that teachers can use to explore their own teaching. They could use it as part of exploratory practice, exploratory action research, or action research, and so could do their own narrative inquiry on their own practice in order to learn more about their practice, so that they could find ways of solving puzzles in their teaching, or dealing with particular problems in their teaching that they have identified, or just to learn more about what they do in their classroom, so that they could think of alternative ways of practice. In 2002, Karen Johnson and Paula Garlenbeck published an edited book on narrative inquiry in language teaching, and a very good book in which they published a lot of teachers' narrative inquiry. An excellent book of very good examples of teachers, and also pre-service teachers they've also done work on, where they do their own narrative inquiry on their own practice in order to understand it better. So that's the most important implication for teaching practice, is when the teachers do their own narrative inquiry. And one way of getting teachers to do that, of course, is to train them how to do it in their teacher education, so that you can't just expect teachers to be able to do narrative inquiry, or any teacher research for that matter, when they start teaching, if they don't know how to do it. So as part of their pre-service teacher training, it would be great if there was an opportunity for them to develop the narrative inquiry skills that they could then, when they start teaching, so it becomes a habit in a way, that they continue to do some aspects of narrative inquiry. And why I think narrative inquiry is particularly suitable is because it involves stories. And teachers tell stories all the time. You sit in the staff room, the faculty room, and all you hear is stories. And so the stories are something that are ubiquitous. They're there around us all the time, and to use those in some ways, and to get learners to tell stories. There's a great opportunity to learn about what we do in our classrooms and in our schools and in our communities, in order to understand it better.
Yeah, I think it's great that the narrative inquiry have such potential of pedagogical implication. But that also reminds me of a question that I'm considering is, just now you mentioned that the teachers can do narrative inquiry, and researchers can do narrative inquiry, and teachers can do that for teaching, not for maybe researching. Right. Then how do you define like a researcher's position in narrative inquiry? What kind of position research needs to take while conduct narrative inquiry? Yeah.
So that's interesting, because it can vary, obviously. So some types of narrative research, there can be very little engagement with the participants. So, and I'm going to get on to your question more directly, but if you look at the engagement between the researcher and the participants, so one point of view with narrative is that there should be a very, very close engagement, so that research, let's just say researchers and teachers doing narrative inquiry would work very, very closely together. That they would collaborate to generate the data, to co-construct the stories that are being told, whether they are in an interview situation or whether they are in classroom observation situations and so on. So there's very, very close engagement. That the relationship is very, very close. Not only in the generation of data, but also then in the analysis of the data. So once the data has been produced, to work on to analyze the data, sharing an analysis, sharing an interpretation of the data. So very, very close relationship. So that's on one extreme, I guess, of the continuum. So the researcher is sort of positioned very much as a collaborator with participants of the story, of the storytellers, right? On the other extreme, you get narrative research, where the researchers don't engage much with the participants, where their focus is more on the narrative text that has been produced, say, by others in a conversation. So they would be interested in conversation analysis, and they may not have been around when the conversational text was produced, and so they would be doing a discourse analysis or conversation analysis of text. So there's little engagement there with the participants in terms of how their text was generated. But they would position them, and in any report of their analysis, they would still position themselves as to how, what their theoretical position is as a narrative researcher, or as someone who is an analyst of a particular piece of text. Theoretically, they'd say why they're doing it that way. So there's sort of theoretical answers to your question. There also there also answers in terms of how the data is generated, what one does with the data, and then there are also ethical issues, because how much ownership does the researcher take of the stories or of the data that was told? Where does the story stop being the participant's story and becomes the researcher's story? You see, and so one needs to be quite honest about how those decisions are made, and particularly with narrative inquiry, because stories can be extremely personal. Once you start telling a story, you may forget there's a tape recorder on the table, because the story is so interesting. If you're doing a question-answer interview, question-answer, you just give the answer and so on. Once you start telling a story, you get emotionally involved in the story, and sometimes, after the interview, you say, "Oh my God, did I really say that?" Because the story takes you along. And so you need then, as a researcher, to use your judgment about how much of that story do I share, and how much do I not share? What are the ethical boundaries that I have to honor as a researcher? And so it can be it can be quite difficult to have to make those decisions, because often you think, "Oh, that bit of it is so amazing, I want to include that in my analysis," but sometimes you have to decide that you can't.
So you mentioned, speaking of the ethical issues in narrative inquiry, I'm just wondering about the research rigor and the validity issues. So it seems to me that narrative inquiry also allows possibility of telling and retelling and re-engaging by multiple authors and multiple speakers with the same stories, or same topic, multiple people talking about issues differently, and then retold the stories over and over and over again. If so, how does the narrative inquiry can maintain, or the dependability or research rigor in that sense?
If I think I'm understanding your question. You know, one way of ensuring that you maintain the ethical boundaries, and in other words, that the story remains the story of the participant or the because often stories, even though it's the story of your participant or your participants, those stories are generated for research purposes, and that's one thing you have to acknowledge, right? And those stories are stories of experience, and it's not the actual experience. Those experiences are lived, they've gone, and stories are the reflection of those experiences. So it's already filtered in a way. Okay, and so we've got the story that happens in the head, and then we get the discourse level where the stories are actually told in some way or are written in some way. And then what happens sometimes is that story's told, the researcher takes the story and they completely forgets about the participant and goes and does whatever they want to with that story. Now there are ethical questions raised, okay, because then that story becomes the property of the researcher, even though they may, you know, the participant may have signed it off and said, I give consent, that's fine. So there's that possibility. There are other ways of doing it. So once the story has been told, then and let's say it's an interview, or maybe the researcher writes a story based on observations or some other way, then that text, that level, can then be given back to the participants. And then there could be a discussion of that product or that artifact could be given back to the participant, and then there could be a discussion of that. And so the participant is then brought back into the process, and then there may be changes made. And then if the researcher does some further interpretation, and that could go back. So there could be a constant back and forth. That's why in that model of narrative knowledging I have like double-headed arrows, because there is the potential for back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Now, how much you do that, of course, is a big question, because you know, we have dissertations to write, and we have articles to write, and there's got to be a product at some point in the real world, right? And so, so things have to end at some point. But I think if, as much as possible, if the participants know, well, they have to know exactly what's going on and when things are happening, that's you know, really favorable. And to share with the participants as much of what you're doing all the way through, and for them to be happy with the process. And again, I say particularly with narrative inquiry, because often the stories are personal, they're emotional, even in areas that seem quite neutral and quite harmless, you know, like you know, doing a task in the classroom. They're never neutral, they're never harmless, there's always something happening. And so, you know, if you, so yeah, that's my point. So it's a long answer to a question that we could talk for a long time about. But it's just a process of managing it as fairly as possible to be,
Okay, so as a PhD student, I also wonder somehow a practical, also a methodological question. You've mentioned in your book that there is a distinction between narrative analysis and analysis of narratives. Would you mind explain a little bit of the distinction between the two, or do they go along?
Okay.
Maybe in one project?
Okay. So if you look at it as a continuum, right? So those two terms used by Donald Polkinghorne in a 1995 article, and in other places by a lot of other people. So he refers to analysis of narratives as an approach to analyzing narrative data, which is very similar to the conventional thematic or content analysis that we do in qualitative research. So you have a text which is typically, it may be in story form or it may be non-story data, where you look for themes, where you code for themes, you look for themes for sub-themes, and you group those into categories and so on. So I always think of it as sort of ripping a story apart. You know, you've got a lovely story, and then you sort of break it down into this theme and that theme and that theme and that theme, and then you group those two together, and you group those two, and often in a dissertation or in an article, you would then discuss that category, and you would discuss that category, and then discuss this one, and those would be your findings, right? So you have the data, and then and then you categorize it. And he bases that analytical approach on the work of Brunner, different ways of knowing, a sort of analytical, a paradigmatic way of knowing, where you sort of break things down into categories. You break things in the world down to different categories. But on the other end of that continuum, so that's a thematic analysis, right? On the other end of that continuum, what he calls narrative analysis is the opposite of that. It's putting things together or configuring the data into a story form. So where the researcher actually writes a story based on the data. Now that may sound easy, but in fact it's not, because what you're doing is you're writing an academic story. You're writing a story that is focusing on your research topic, but drawing on the data. So it's a research story. And these can take different forms. They can be long or short, depending on what you want to do with them, what the purpose of those stories is. And so often you'll have a big set of data. In order to write that story, you may need to do a thematic analysis of the data in order to know what themes are important, so that you can then write the story. So you may need to do both. And then once you've got the story, you can do a thematic analysis of that story.
Right.
Particularly if you are working with multiple participants. Say you may have 4 or 5 stories that you have then written, and then you can do a thematic analysis of those 4 or 5 stories. So it can be back and forth along that continuum in different ways of doing it. If you've got a very big data set with lots of people, that it's quite useful doing that. So some of my PhD students have a sort of design for their dissertation where they'll have a chapter consisting of stories or the narratives of their participants that they've generated from the data, and then they'll have a chapter which is like a cross-case analysis. So they'll do a thematic analysis of the 10 stories that they've written, and then they do a cross-case thematic analysis, which they then do in a chapter, and then they'll have like a discussion chapter in which they then analyze their different analysis more sort of academically, bringing back the literature and so on. So there are different ways of doing it, but those are essentially those 2 approaches, but they're not distinct. They lie along a continuum. So even in writing the story, a narrative, you're doing some thematic analysis anyway, and in doing a thematic analysis, you're still paying attention to the story. And in reporting the thematic analysis, you will still be writing some mini stories as well to explain the themes and to illustrate the themes. So they work along. I would like to think of it as you're somewhere along that continuum. But the sort of classical narrative inquirers, sociology and so on, would write these extended stories. I like to try and challenge myself in the writing of my findings to write stories. So even in quite big data sets, to write say like a 2,000 word narrative or 1,000, 2,000 word narrative of my participants, because it's extremely challenging. It's not just summarizing the data. It's writing about your research questions, making sure that you're focusing on your research questions, that you've got the topics, that you've included there what's in the data. You don't want to forget that, but you also want to focus on your research questions. And you want your theoretical approach also to be there in the data.
Exactly.
You know, you don't want to forget what theoretical perspective you're taking on your data. You want that to shine through in your narrative as well. So that there's multiple perspectives you want to see in the narrative that you produce. So it's quite challenging, but it's really a good thing to do, even if you don't use that story in a publication. But it's a good analytical approach. Phil Benson refers to it as writing as analysis. So the writing is actually analysis.
So it seems that there are varieties and then different ways of representing, different ways of analyzing the narrative inquiry. And given the diversity and epistemological diversity and methodological diversities of narrative inquiry, could you please give us what are the key components of narrative inquiry that would be considered as a narrative inquiry?
Yeah, it's a big question. So, I'll just very quickly summarize five core dimensions. I think that always help ground, to sort of ground myself in what narrative inquiry is. I won't go into a long thing about them, but I try to think of five dimensions. One is the distinction between narrative study and narrative inquiry, where narrative study is more the focus on studying what narrative is, what story is, the structure of story, the sequence of story content, whereas narrative inquiry is more a method to learn about some phenomenon. So it's using a method to learn about teacher identity, for example. So narrative study is studying narrative as text, for example, or narrative inquiry as a methodology. But it's a continuum because there's bits of both. So that's one of those dimensions. Another is the one we spoke about earlier, narrative analysis versus analysis of narratives. That's where you, in terms of analysis, doing the more thematic analysis, content analysis, whereas on the other end of the continuum, doing a more sort of configuration of stories, putting things into story forms. That's a second dimension. A third dimension is the type of data we work with. So often the data is not in story form, but you could still be doing narrative inquiry. So you may do an interview where you've got a question, answer, question, answer, question, answer, but there's no story in sight. There's no real story there. But you can configure that into a story form, for example. So you could still be doing narrative inquiry. Whereas often in narrative inquiry, you are working with actual stories. This, of course, raises the question, what do we mean by story? And that's a big question which we won't go into here. But that third dimension relates to the type of data we work with, whether it's in story form or whether it's non-story data. Another dimension refers to the engagement, which we spoke about earlier, the researcher engagement with participants, the relationship they have with participants, whether it's a close relationship, working together, collaborating together, being in the midst is what Clarendon and Connolly refer to. So that's working closely in classrooms or in schools or in work settings and so on, in generating, analyzing the data, being very entangled with them. Whereas far less engagement can still be narrative research, where you analyze texts that someone's produced in a conversation in a setting you've never been to and never met the participants. So more or less engagement. And the other dimension is one where the narrative data is produced in interaction, so in interviews or conversations and so on. And there one along this dimension on the one side is what's called stories as interaction, and that is where the emphasis in the analysis is how the stories are produced as social action. So, you know, if you look at identity, for example, how it is, how identities are generated in the doing of social action, in the interaction. But on the other side, looking at perhaps taking an excerpt from an interview and then analyzing it for its content or for the themes in that excerpt. So that's what I call stories from interaction. So those are just dimensions that help me focus a little bit on what narrative inquiry is. There's a lot more, but you know, I could go on. There are probably other dimensions, but those are just 5 key ones that I've come up with over the years that sort of ground me, I think. Yeah.
Wow, thank you. So I guess we are towards the end. So would you mind sharing with us your current research projects in narrative inquiry?
Okay, yeah, I'm involved in a few, but just one interesting one was I 15 years ago, just over 15 years ago, I interviewed a group of what I call pre-immigrants. These were people living in South Africa who had planned to immigrate to New Zealand. And they were Afrikaans speakers or certainly bilingual English Afrikaans speakers. And they had planned to move to New Zealand, and I interviewed them in South Africa before they immigrated. And I kept, well, one of the participants did in fact immigrate to New Zealand, and when she arrived with her family, she contacted me, and we went out for lunch, and you know, asked how she was doing, and that was fine, and then I never heard from her again. And then last year, 2018, 15 years later, exactly 15 years later, she contacted me and said she was going to be on the university campus. Should we meet? I said yes, that was good. And then we ended up, long story short, we ended up having another interview about her experiences of being an immigrant and her language use and language experiences, her identity and how that had changed over the years and so on. So I'm in the process of analyzing that data and also really looking at the emotional changes in the stories that she tells. In fact, I'm asking other people to respond to some of the emotions that she's expressing in the story she's telling. So I'm still in the process of collecting some of that data. So that's one I'm really excited about. And another one I'm working on is looking at a group of PhD students in Colombia in South America. And they are just finished their first year of study, and they're very experienced English teachers and language teacher educators. And I was interested in their experiences of quite late in their careers moving on to do a PhD, and some of the reasons for doing that, but also their identity changes. And what I'm finding there is that they started as a cohort, and it's interesting to see how they work together as a group of students, and some of the sort of moral issues that they are experiencing within the educational context of Colombia. But also interesting how their reasons for doing a PhD relate to their investment, and how their investment relates to their identity changes that they are experiencing. So I'm working on those two, and I've got a couple of other writing projects, but those essentially are the sort of data that I'm working with at the moment.
Wow. So
thank you.
Thank you. There is so much to talk about, but due to the time constraint, we'll finish our conversation. But please, if you have any questions, post it below, any kinds of questions that you have, and we are happy to have more discussions.
Yes.
And thank you, Dr. Gary.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it.
Okay. And lastly, I have to remind that remember that we'll put some useful links and resources down on the comments below. And if you like our interview sessions and live streaming sessions with world-renowned scholars, please subscribe to our channel.
And
So,
like.
Yeah, and like it. Okay?
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, bye-bye.